In this video of the cell cycle, you're going to learn the role that the cell cycle plays in a variety of activities. It's not as easy to develop and use a model to explain the role of cellular reproduction unless you understand where some of the components come from. What happens while they're developing, how it differentiates, how it divides, and then how it regulates itself, and then of course when the regulation goes awry. How do we regulate the cell cycle? How do cells know when it's time to divide and then when it's time not to divide? And what happens if this regulation fails? Regulation of the cell cycle is controlled by, it's a chemical control system. It starts and stops events in the cell. Proteins play a key role in this, but it's a chemical signaling that goes on inside of the actual cell itself. There's an external signaling that comes from outside of the cell when the cell's interacting with its environment. Sometimes it's nutrients, so it can be environmentally based. Also hormones can set off that chemical cascade of division. It can also be internal. It can come from the own cell's internal DNA system. And that DNA inside of the cell will signal to the cell, hey, it's time to divide. The cell cycle has checkpoints. These are critical points at where stop and go signals are regulated. In G1, S phase, and G2, we often will sometimes call those resting phases. So G0, for example, has become like a resting state. G1 is where the cell does its own cell thing, and it's affectionately called resting. However, cell division is mostly in the off position for cells and animal cells until something has triggered it to happen. Apoptosis. That's programmed cell death. We've heard of that before when we looked at lysosome organelles inside of the cell. But this is an internal and external signal to activate genes that produce self-destruction, or they produce self-destructive enzymes. The nucleus ultimately shrinks and breaks apart. So when we're in the womb, we actually have webbed fingers. We have to get rid of that webbing because babies aren't born with webbed fingers and toes like ducks. So the cells in between each finger go through a programmed cell death, and fingers are more defined. We know this because sometimes it can go wrong, as seen in this photo right here. If we were to x-ray this person's foot, we would see that all 5 toes are present and all bones are accounted for. But this cellular programmed cell death didn't happen at birth. This person was born with the connective tissue in between 2 toes. When mitosis goes out of control and we have uncontrolled cell division, that's what cancer is. This happens when the regulation of the cell cycle is broken down. And the cancer cells, they divide much more often than normal healthy cells do. They divide uncontrollably. And this leads to the formation of tumors. They're clumps of cells that have divided uncontrollably. There's no programmed cell death going on, or if it is going on, it's not programmed to happen until way later. So the cell just continues to go through mitosis after round of mitosis, dividing itself over and over and over again, going through the cell cycle. Now, the cellular programming can have many outcomes. It's called benign when the abnormal cells typically remain all clustered together. Sometimes that's harmless, and we can actually easily go in and remove those. Malignant is when the cancer cells have broken away from where they originally were. They've moved to other different parts of the body, and they've signaled other cells, creating more tumors. When cancer has metastasized, it is spreading disease from one organ to another. And that's really serious because in order for it to leave its own cellular area, it has to break through tissues and then get into the full organ. When we have uncontrolled cellular division out of control on an organ level, that's when cancer has metastasized. It's very serious. Now, why does this happen? Research has many reasons of what they think causes cancer, reasons for cancer causing, anything. Some of them are just biological, like you inherited the genetic mutation that causes this type of cellular division to happen. It can be lifestyle choices, like the foods that you eat, or your physical activity, lack of physical activity. Sometimes it's the exposure to UV radiation, like UV radiation from the sun, like not using sunscreen. Believe it or not, there are viruses and other different types of infections that can cause cancer. As teenagers, you may know of the HPV vaccine. That is a virus that causes cervical cancer. So viruses, can cause uncontrolled cellular division. Also, your body and cells can be exposed to carcinogens. Carcinogens are chemicals that can cause cancer. They usually will mutate the DNA and trigger something in the cell that will cause a cascade of uncontrolled cellular division. We find these carcinogens in things like asbestos and then tobacco products, tobacco smoke.